She was turned down on a Christmas blind date until a little girl whispered, "Will you be my mom?" Welcome to True Soul Narratives, where every story carries a heartbeat. Love, betrayal, kindness, forgiveness, and the courage to start again. Before we start, comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Audrey Mitchell sat alone at a table in the middle of the Winter Rose, one of the city's most beautiful restaurants, surrounded by twinkling Christmas lights and couples holding hands across candlelit tables. Wreaths hung on every wall, garland wrapped around columns, soft carols played in the background. It should have been magical. Instead, it was devastating. Her blind date had just walked out. 10 minutes. That's all it had taken for Connor to decide she wasn't worth his time. He'd stood up, dropped cash on the table for a single drink, and delivered the final blow with practiced ease. "You're not really what I expected." Then he was gone, leaving her sitting there with every eye in the restaurant watching her humiliation. Audrey fought back tears, her hands trembling as she reached for her purse. She needed to leave, now, before she completely fell apart in public. But then she saw her, a little girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old, standing a few feet away from her table. Big brown eyes staring at Audrey with an intensity that made her freeze. The child didn't move, didn't blink, just watched her like she was searching for something desperately important. Then the little girl walked forward, stopped right beside Audrey's chair, and whispered 3 words that made the entire world stop spinning. "Will you be my mom?" Audrey's breath caught in her throat, her tears forgotten, her heartbreak suspended. Because this child, this stranger with curly dark hair and pigtails and a red velvet Christmas dress, was looking at her like she'd been searching her whole life and finally found what she was looking for. What this child said next would reveal a connection neither of them knew existed, a promise made in a hospital 2 years ago, and a miracle that would change both their lives forever. But to understand this moment, to understand why a 5-year-old girl would ask a heartbroken stranger to be her mother, we need to go back to earlier that day. Audrey Mitchell was 32 years old, and she worked as a pediatric nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital. Her days were long, emotionally exhausting, and filled with sick children and terrified parents in medical crises that required every ounce of skill and compassion she possessed. She loved it in a way that confused most people, in a way that made dating nearly impossible, in a way that had shaped her entire adult life. Because Audrey had a gift for connecting with children, for making them feel safe when they were scared, for holding their hands through procedures that hurt, for singing soft lullabies when no one else was there. She poured everything she had into those kids. And she was single, had always been single, never been married, never even come close. After a series of disappointing relationships in her 20s, she'd mostly given up on finding someone who understood her calling, someone who didn't see her work as competition or her compassion as weakness. Most holidays, Audrey volunteered to work so her colleagues with families could be home. Christmas Eve, Thanksgiving, New Year's. It didn't matter. She'd rather be at the hospital where she felt useful than sitting alone in her apartment pretending she wasn't lonely. But her younger sister Paige had other ideas. Paige was 28, newly engaged, deliriously happy, and convinced that Audrey's solitary life was some kind of tragedy that needed immediate intervention. "You can't spend another Christmas alone, Audrey," Paige had said last week, her voice gentle but firm. "You deserve love. You deserve someone who sees how incredible you are." Audrey had smiled and changed the subject the way she always did, because she didn't believe it anymore, didn't believe there was someone out there who'd accept all of her. The parts that cared too much, felt too deeply, brought work home in the form of worry about patients she couldn't save. She'd been told more than once that she was too much, too caring, too emotional, too invested in her work with sick kids. And eventually, she'd started to believe it. But Paige was relentless. She'd set up a blind date for December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, at a restaurant Audrey could never afford on her own. "His name is Connor," Paige had explained, showing Audrey his photo on her phone. "He's a finance guy, really successful, handsome, and my friend says he's looking for something serious. Just give him a chance, please." Audrey had reluctantly agreed, partly because Paige wouldn't stop asking, and partly because some small, stubborn part of her still hoped. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe someone would finally see past the surface and recognize what she had to offer. It was almost Christmas after all. Maybe something magical would happen. She got ready carefully that evening, choosing a dress that made her feel pretty without trying too hard, doing her hair in soft waves, putting on makeup with hands that trembled slightly from nerves. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she tried to feel hopeful, tried to believe that tonight might be the beginning of something good. The winter rose was exactly as beautiful as Paige had promised. Audrey arrived right on time, gave her name to the hostess, and was led to a table near the center of the restaurant. Christmas decorations sparkled everywhere. White lights wrapped around dark wood beams, wreaths with red ribbons, poinsettias on every surface. Couples filled the other tables, leaning close, laughing softly, looking at each other like they'd found something precious. Audrey sat down, smoothed her dress, and waited. Her heart beat faster than it should. She was genuinely trying, genuinely open to this, genuinely hoping that maybe, just maybe, this man would be different. Connor arrived 15 minutes late. She saw him walk in, tall and handsome in an expensive suit, scanning the restaurant with the confidence of someone who knew his worth. The hostess pointed toward Audrey's table. Connor walked over, and Audrey stood up with a smile, ready to introduce herself. But before she could speak, she saw it. The way his eyes traveled over her, head to toe, assessing, calculating. The way his smile faltered just slightly, like he'd opened a gift and found something disappointing inside. They sat down. Connor ordered a whiskey without asking if Audrey wanted anything. Then he pulled out his phone and set it on the table face up, his attention already divided. Audrey tried to make conversation, asking about his work, his interests, anything to break the awkward tension. She mentioned she was a nurse, worked at Children's Memorial. Connor glanced up briefly. "So you're a nurse? That must be draining." There was something dismissive in his tone, like he'd already categorized her job as unimpressive. Audrey felt her hope begin to crumble, but she pushed forward. She explained that she worked with children specifically, that despite the heartbreak of seeing kids suffer, she loved being there for them, loved making a difference in their lives. Connor barely listened. His eyes kept drifting to other tables, to his phone, to anywhere but her. After exactly 10 minutes, his phone buzzed. He picked it up, frowned dramatically, and stood up. "Look, I'm really sorry, but I have to take this. Work emergency." Audrey knew it was a lie. She could see it in the relief on his face, the way he was already reaching for his wallet. He dropped a $20 bill on the table, more than enough to cover his single drink, and looked at her with something almost like pity. "You seem nice," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed. "But you're not really what I expected. My friend showed me your sister's Instagram. You look different." The words hit like a slap. Different. Translation. Thinner. More glamorous. More filtered. Less real. Less her. Connor walked away without waiting for a response, weaving through tables toward the exit, probably already texting his friends about the disappointing blind date he'd just escaped. Audrey sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table, fighting back the tears that burned behind her eyes. She could feel other diners watching, their curious glances, their pity. The humiliation was suffocating. Typical, she thought bitterly. Never enough, always too something or not enough, something else. Too real, too caring, too invested in things that didn't matter to men like Connor. She reached for her purse, ready to signal for the check and flee before she completely fell apart. That's when she noticed her. A little girl standing a few feet away, partially hidden behind a column wrapped in garland. 5 years old, maybe 6, with the kind of face that belonged in Christmas cards. Big brown eyes that seemed too knowing for her age. Curly dark hair pulled into pigtails with red ribbons that matched her red velvet Christmas dress. She clutched a stuffed reindeer in one arm, holding it against her chest like a security blanket. But what struck Audrey most was the way the child was staring at her. Not with the casual curiosity of a kid people watching in a restaurant. With intense, focused attention, like she was studying Audrey, searching for something specific, trying to solve a puzzle only she could see. The girl wasn't shy, wasn't scared, She just stood there, completely still, watching Audrey with an expression that made Audrey's breath catch. Like recognition, like she'd been looking for Audrey and had finally, impossibly found her. If you're enjoying this story of unexpected connections and Christmas miracles, subscribe to True Soul Narratives for more heartwarming tales that remind us why kindness and love matter most. Audrey wiped quickly at her eyes, forcing a smile, even though her heart was still breaking. "Hi, sweetie," she said softly, her nurse voice kicking in automatically. "Are you okay?" The little girl didn't answer. She just kept staring. And somewhere across the restaurant, at a table Audrey couldn't see, the girl's father sat completely unaware that his daughter had wandered off. Completely unaware that in the next few minutes, a question from a 5-year-old child would change 3 lives forever. The little girl walked straight to Audrey's table without hesitation, her steps small but certain, like she'd made a decision and nothing would change her mind. Audrey wiped at her eyes quickly, forcing herself to compose, to be the calm adult in this situation even though she felt like she was falling apart. "Hi, sweetie," she said gently, leaning forward slightly. "Are you lost?" Ruby didn't answer. She just stood there, those huge brown eyes fixed on Audrey's face with an intensity that was almost unnerving. Then so quietly the words were barely audible over the soft Christmas music, she said, "You're sad." Audrey's breath caught in her throat. The directness of children always got her, the way they saw straight through adult pretenses to the truth underneath. She tried to smile, to deflect. "I'm okay. Are you here with your family?" Ruby completely ignored the question. Her small face was serious, almost solemn. "The man was mean to you." And Audrey realized with a fresh wave of humiliation that this child had witnessed the entire scene. Had watched Connor look at her with disappointment, had watched him walk away, had seen Audrey sitting here alone trying not to cry. "It's okay," Audrey said, her voice catching despite her best efforts. "Sometimes grown-ups just don't match, that's all." Ruby's expression didn't change. "He was stupid. You're pretty." Those 3 words, delivered with such simple conviction by a 5-year-old child, hit Audrey harder than anything Connor had said. Her heart clenched painfully. When had a compliment from a child ever hurt this much? When had kindness from a stranger felt like it was breaking her open? She couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at this little girl who was looking at her like she mattered, like she was worth something, like she was exactly enough. Then Ruby did something that made Audrey's world tilt completely off its axis. She climbed into the chair Connor had abandoned, the expensive suit Connor who'd left because Audrey wasn't what he expected. Ruby settled into that chair like she belonged there, hugging her stuffed reindeer close to her chest, her feet dangling high above the floor. She just sat there watching Audrey in silence. The moment stretched long and strange and heavy with something Audrey couldn't name. Then Ruby spoke again, so quietly Audrey almost missed it. "Will you be my mom?" Audrey froze completely. Her brain stuttered, unable to process what she just heard. "What?" Ruby's voice came louder now, urgent and desperate, in a way that made Audrey's chest tight. "Will you be my mom, please?" Audrey's eyes filled with fresh tears. This was too much. Too strange. Too heartbreaking. This child she didn't know, asking a question that didn't make sense, looking at her with such raw need that Audrey felt like she was drowning. "Sweetie, she started, but couldn't finish. Where's your mother?" Ruby's small face crumpled. The change was instant and devastating. "Heaven," she whispered, her voice breaking on the word. "She's in heaven." Before Audrey could respond, before she could reach out to comfort this child who'd just shattered her heart, a man appeared beside the table. He was tall, early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of exhausted face that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Ruby!" His voice was sharp with panic. "You can't just walk away from the table." He reached for his daughter but stopped when he saw her sitting with a crying stranger, his expression shifting to alarm. "I'm so sorry," he said quickly, looking at Audrey with mortification. "She's been doing this lately, approaching random women. I don't know why. I'm trying to—" He stopped mid-sentence. His eyes, which had been frantically apologetic, suddenly focused on Audrey's face with startling intensity. His expression shifted from panic to confusion to something that looked almost like shock. "Wait," his voice dropped, uncertain. Do I know you? Audrey stared at him, wiping at her tears, feeling that same strange sense of familiarity she couldn't place. I don't think so, she said. But even as she spoke, something nagged at her, something about his eyes, the exhaustion in them, the grief. The man sat down heavily in the chair next to Ruby, still staring at Audrey like he was trying to solve an impossible puzzle. He introduced himself slowly. I'm Dylan Foster, and you're a nurse at Children's Memorial. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, certain and impossible. Audrey nodded, her confusion deepening. How does he know that? You were there, Dylan continued, his face going pale, his voice shaking slightly. 2 years ago, November, my wife, Ruby's mother, she was in a car accident. Audrey's breath stopped. The restaurant noise faded to nothing. She was pregnant, 8 months. They did an emergency C-section to save the baby. Dylan's voice cracked, years of pain bleeding through every word. She never woke up. Died 3 days later. And suddenly, horrifyingly, Audrey remembered. The memory crashed over her like a wave, vivid and sharp and devastating. November 2 years ago, a woman rushed into the ER, critical condition from a car accident, 8 months pregnant. The emergency C-section performed in a race against time. The premature baby, so tiny, barely 3 pounds, struggling to breathe. The mother clinging to life in the ICU, brain swelling, prognosis grim. Audrey had been assigned to the NICU, had taken one look at that impossibly small infant, fighting for every breath, and something in her had broken and reformed around the need to help this child survive. She'd held that baby for hours when no one else could, when the understaffed night shift meant someone had to stay. She'd stayed past the end of her shifts, singing soft lullabies, stroking tiny fingers, whispering promises. You're going to be okay. You're so strong. You're so loved. She'd bonded with that baby in a way nurses weren't supposed to, visiting her every shift even when she wasn't assigned to that room, checking charts, celebrating every small victory. The father had been destroyed. Audrey remembered him too now, sitting in the NICU at all hours, staring at his daughter through the incubator glass, barely speaking, barely functioning. The day his wife died, Audrey had found him collapsed in the hallway outside the ICU, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe. She'd held him, this stranger, while he shattered. Had told him his daughter would survive, that she'd make sure of it, that he wasn't alone. And then, months later, when the baby was finally stable enough to go home, Audrey had been transferred to a different unit. She'd thought about that baby sometimes, wondered if she was okay, but she'd never followed up. Never knew what happened to her. That baby was Ruby, Dylan said, his voice breaking completely. Audrey's gaze snapped to the little girl sitting in Connor's abandoned chair, and suddenly she could see it. The infant she'd cradled was this child, alive and healthy and staring at her with recognition Audrey couldn't understand. She was so tiny, Audrey whispered, tears streaming down her face now. I didn't think they said she might not make it. She made it, Dylan said, his own eyes wet, because of people like you, because you wouldn't let her be alone. Ruby was watching this exchange with intense focus, her little face serious, like she understood more than a 5-year-old should. I showed her photos of her mother every night, Dylan explained, his voice thick with emotion. Every night before bed, I pull up pictures on my phone, tell her stories about her mom. And last week, she found an old hospital photo I'd forgotten was on there. A nurse had taken it in the NICU, trying to document Ruby's progress. You were in the background, holding her. Just for a second, barely visible. But Ruby saw you. She's been obsessed ever since, asking who you were, why you were holding her, if you were her angel. I didn't know, Dylan continued, running a hand through his hair. I barely remembered faces from that time. Everything was a blur of grief and terror. But she remembered you, said she felt safe with you. Audrey couldn't breathe. A newborn couldn't remember. It was medically impossible. But Ruby was looking at her with such certainty, such recognition, like her soul remembered even if her mind couldn't possibly. I held her for hours, Audrey said, her voice shaking. Every shift, I couldn't leave her alone. I made a promise to your wife before she died. Dylan froze completely, his face going white. What? Audrey's tears fell faster now, the memory she'd buried for 2 years rising up with painful clarity. She woke up for just a few minutes, after the birth, before she slipped into the coma. The doctors let me in because I'd been caring for the baby. She was barely conscious, could barely speak. But she asked me, she begged me, to watch over her baby, to make sure she knew love. Audrey's voice broke. I promised her. I promised I would. Then she slipped away and never woke up again. Dylan stared at her, shock and grief and something like awe crossing his face. No one told me that. No one said she'd woken up at all. Because it was so brief, Audrey said. Maybe 30 seconds. Just long enough for a mother to try to save her child one last way. Ruby reached out suddenly, her small hand taking Audrey's larger one. The touch was warm, trusting, certain. You're my angel, Ruby said simply, her voice clear and sure. Daddy says Mommy sent angels to help me when she couldn't be here. You're my angel, Audrey sobbed, the sound escaping before she could stop it. And I want you to stay, Ruby finished, squeezing Audrey's hand with surprising strength for such a small child. Don't leave me again. In that moment, surrounded by Christmas lights and strangers and the wreckage of a blind date that had seemed like the worst thing in the world an hour ago, Audrey understood. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't random. This was a promise kept in ways she'd never imagined. A promise made to a dying mother, carried forward by a child who shouldn't remember but somehow did, leading them all back to each other exactly when they needed it most. Dylan sat down heavily in the third chair at their table, like his legs couldn't hold him anymore. He looked overwhelmed, stunned, like the ground beneath him had just shifted and he was struggling to find his balance. I've been failing her, he said quietly, his voice raw with guilt. Audrey started to protest, but he shook his head. 2 years. 2 years and I still don't know how to be both parents. I wake up every day terrified I'm doing it wrong, that I'm not enough, that she's going to grow up damaged because I can't figure out how to fill the hole her mother left. Ruby was still holding Audrey's hand, watching her father with those two knowing eyes. She asks for her mother every night, Dylan continued, his voice breaking. Before bed, she asks when Mommy's coming home. And I have to tell her again that Mommy's in heaven. And she cries, and I hold her and I don't know what else to do. He ran his hands over his face, exhaustion pouring off him. And lately she's been approaching women, in stores, at parks, at the library, just walking up to random women and staring at them. Sometimes she asks them if they'll be her mom. It breaks my heart every single time. I thought maybe she needed therapy, Dylan said, looking at Audrey with desperation. Thought maybe I was failing her so badly that she was traumatized, acting out. But maybe, he paused, his gaze moving between Audrey and Ruby. Maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she was looking for you. Audrey wiped at her tears with shaking hands, unable to stop them from falling. She looked at Ruby, really looked at her, seeing both the fragile infant she'd once been and the strong child she'd become. I never forgot you, Audrey said, her voice thick with emotion. I think about the babies I've cared for all the time. Wonder how they're doing, if they're happy, if they remember being in the hospital at all. But especially you. You fought so hard. Every day was a battle, and you won every single one. Ruby's small voice cut through the emotion. Because you told me to. I remember. Audrey's breath caught in her throat. That was impossible. Newborns didn't form conscious memories. Ruby had been days old, weeks old, fighting just to survive. She couldn't possibly remember. She talks about a voice, Dylan said quietly, his eyes fixed on Audrey's face. Says someone sang to her when she was little, told her to be strong, that she was loved, that she had to keep fighting. I thought she was confusing dreams with reality, that maybe she'd heard the story so many times she'd created false memories. Audrey felt her world tilt again. She had sung to Ruby, every shift for weeks, the same lullaby her own mother had sung to her as a child. You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. She'd sung it softly while holding Ruby, while checking her monitors, while sitting beside her incubator during quiet night shifts. Could a newborn remember? Medical science said no. But could a soul remember? Could some part of a person hold on to the feeling of being loved, being cared for, being promised they wouldn't be alone? The restaurant manager approached their table, his expression concerned, probably worried about the crying adults and the small child who'd wandered from her table. But when he got close enough to see their faces, to sense the weight of what was happening, he stopped. His expression softened. Instead of asking them to leave or checking if everything was okay, he simply nodded to a waiter and quietly sent over hot chocolate for Ruby and fresh coffee for the adults. "On the house," he said gently. "Merry Christmas." Then he walked away, giving them privacy for whatever healing was happening at that table. Dylan looked at Audrey, his eyes red-rimmed and honest. "I know this is insane. You just got rejected by some idiot on a blind date. You came here tonight expecting something completely different. And now a strange man and his daughter are crying at your table, telling you impossible stories about memories and promises and connections that shouldn't exist." He paused, swallowing hard. "But could you maybe stay? Just for tonight. Let Ruby have this. She hasn't smiled this much since her mother died." Audrey looked at Ruby, who was watching her with such hope, such desperate longing. Like Audrey held the answer to every question she'd been asking for 2 years. Audrey thought about her empty apartment waiting for her across the city, the Christmas Eve she'd planned to spend alone, probably crying over the humiliation of tonight's date, the blind date that was supposed to fill the void in her life, but had only made it deeper. And she thought about the promise she'd made to a dying woman. "Watch over my baby. Make sure she knows love." "Yes," Audrey said, the word coming out clear and certain. "I'll stay." Ruby launched herself out of her chair and into Audrey's arms with a force that nearly knocked them both backward. The hug was desperate. Wow, by tight, real, deep. Small arms wrapped around Audrey's neck, a small body pressed against her chest, and Audrey closed her eyes, holding this child she'd saved years ago, who'd somehow, impossibly, found her way back. They stayed like that for a long moment, neither wanting to let go, both holding on like they'd been lost and were finally found. They had dinner together, the three of them at that table in the winter rose. Ruby sat between Audrey and Dylan, talking nonstop in the way only excited 5-year-olds can. She told Audrey about kindergarten, about her teacher, Miss Roberts, who let her be line leader twice, about her best friend, Emma, who had a trampoline. She introduced her stuffed reindeer properly. "This is Dasher. He's my favorite because reindeer can fly, and that means they can visit Mommy in heaven." Her favorite color was purple. She liked mac and cheese, but not the kind from the box, only the kind Daddy made with 3 different cheeses. She was going to be a veterinarian when she grew up, because animals needed love too. Dylan watched in amazement as Audrey engaged with every word, asking questions, laughing at Ruby's stories, making his daughter bloom under her attention in a way he hadn't seen in months. "You're good at this," he said quietly when Ruby was distracted by her hot chocolate. Audrey smiled. "I'm a pediatric nurse. It's literally my job." "No," Dylan said, his voice serious. "It's more than that. I've seen Ruby around other women. She's shy, cautious, takes forever to warm up. But with you, it's like she's known you her entire life." He paused, his eyes glistening. "Ruby doesn't trust easily, but she trusts you." As the evening wound down, as the restaurant began to empty and Christmas carols played softly, Ruby grew quieter. She leaned against Audrey's shoulder, her eyes drooping, fighting sleep the way children do when they don't want a good thing to end. Audrey wrapped her arm around the small body, holding her close, and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that had been locked closed for years beginning to open. Dylan leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I need to tell you something." Audrey looked up from Ruby's sleepy face. "My wife, before she died, when she was barely conscious those few minutes you described, she said something I never understood." Audrey held her breath. She said, "The one who sings will find her way back." Dylan's voice cracked. "I thought she was delirious, thought the trauma and medication were making her confused. But maybe," he looked at Audrey holding his sleeping daughter, "maybe she knew. Maybe she saw something I couldn't. Maybe she knew you'd come back to us." Audrey's tears fell silently, dripping onto Ruby's dark curls. "I promised her," she whispered. "I promised I wouldn't let Ruby be alone. I've thought about that promise for 2 years. Wondered if I kept it by working at the hospital, by caring for other children, by trying to honor her memory through my work. But maybe, her voice broke, maybe I was supposed to keep it differently. Maybe I was supposed to find my way back here. To her. To you both. Dylan reached across the table and took Audrey's free hand. Thank you, he said simply, for saving her then, and for being here now. And Audrey, holding a sleeping child who'd asked her to be her mother, sitting across from a man who'd trusted her with his most precious thing, realized that maybe the worst night of her life had actually been leading her exactly where she was always meant to be. Dylan carried sleeping Ruby to his car, her small body limp and trusting against his shoulder, one arm still clutching her reindeer. Audrey walked with them through the restaurant, past tables of couples finishing their Christmas dinners, past the twinkling lights and wreaths, out into the cold December night. She wasn't ready to let go. Didn't know how to say goodbye to this child who'd asked her to be her mother, to this man who'd trusted her with his most devastating grief, to this moment that felt like the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life without knowing it. At Dylan's car, parked under a street lamp decorated with a red bow, they stood in awkward silence. How do you end something like this? How do you walk away from a connection that felt written in the stars, ordained by a dying woman, carried forward by a child who shouldn't remember but did? Dylan broke the silence first, his voice soft and grateful. Thank you. For tonight. For 2 years ago. For everything you did for Ruby. For me. For my wife in her last moments. Audrey's throat tightened. She watched Ruby sleeping peacefully against her father's shoulder and felt something break open inside her. Can I, she started, then stopped, terrified of the answer. Can I see her again? The words tumbled out before she could stop them, desperate and vulnerable and honest. Dylan's face transformed. The exhaustion and grief that had lined his features all evening lifted, replaced by something that looked startlingly like joy. A genuine smile, the first real one Audrey had seen from him. I was terrified you'd say no, he admitted. Ruby's going to ask for you every day now, every single day. She's going to wake up tomorrow, and the first thing she'll say is, "Where's Audrey? When is she coming back? Can we call her?" He shifted Ruby's weight slightly, pulling out his phone with his free hand. I'd love for you to see her again. They exchanged numbers, fingers fumbling with cold and emotion, standing in that parking lot far longer than necessary. Neither wanted to be the first to walk away, to break whatever spell had been cast over this impossible evening. Ruby stirred against Dylan's shoulder, her eyes opening slightly, unfocused and sleepy. She saw Audrey still standing there and smiled. You didn't leave, she murmured, her voice soft and content. No, sweetheart, Audrey said, reaching out to brush a curl from Ruby's forehead. I'm not leaving. The next day was Christmas Eve. Audrey woke up in her empty apartment, the morning sun streaming through windows she'd never bothered to put curtains on because it didn't matter. No one was there to see. She lay in bed staring at her phone, at Dylan's number saved in her contacts, wondering if last night had been real or some kind of fever dream brought on by humiliation and loneliness. Then her phone buzzed, a text from Dylan. Ruby won't stop talking about you. She's been awake for an hour asking when you're coming over. Any chance you're free today? Audrey stared at the message, her heart racing. She'd planned to work today, had volunteered weeks ago to take the Christmas Eve shift so her coworkers with families could be home. It's what she always did. But something had shifted. Something fundamental had changed in her understanding of where she belonged. She called the hospital, spoke to her supervisor, asked for a personal day, the first one she'd taken in over a year. Then she texted Dylan back. What's your address? Dylan's apartment was modest, a 2-bedroom in a neighborhood that was safe but not fancy, clearly decorated by a single father doing his best. But the moment Audrey walked in, she saw Ruby everywhere. Artwork taped to the refrigerator, crayon drawings covering one entire wall, toys organized in colorful bins, a child-sized table in the corner with a tea set, and photos. So many photos. Of Ruby's mother, beautiful and smiling, holding her pregnant belly. Of the 3 of them together before the accident, Dylan and his wife looking at each other like they'd found everything they'd ever wanted. Audrey felt a pang, not of jealousy but of sorrow. This woman should be here, should be baking Christmas cookies with her daughter, decorating the tree, writing letters to Santa, but she wasn't. And somehow, impossibly, Audrey was. Ruby launched herself at Audrey the moment she walked in, wrapping small arms around her legs with desperate force. "You came back. I told Daddy you would, but he said maybe you were busy, but I knew. I knew you'd come back." They spent the day together, the three of them, doing all the things families do on Christmas Eve. Baking cookies that came out slightly burned because Ruby insisted on helping and added too much flour. Decorating the small tree in the corner with ornaments that were clearly handmade, popsicle sticks and glitter, and Ruby's name written in shaky letters. Watching Christmas movies while drinking hot chocolate that Ruby spilled twice, and writing a letter to Santa. Ruby insisted Audrey help her, the two of them sitting at the child-sized table with crayons and paper covered in stickers. Ruby dictated carefully, her face serious with concentration. "Dear Santa, I've been very good this year. I want a new bike and some books and maybe a puppy, but Daddy says we have to wait for that." Audrey wrote it all down, smiling at Ruby's earnest requests. Then Ruby paused. "But I already got what I really wanted," she said quietly. Audrey's pen stilled. "What's that, sweetheart?" Ruby looked up at her with those huge brown eyes. "You." The simplicity of it broke Audrey's heart and put it back together at the same time. This child who'd lost her mother, who'd spent 2 years asking strangers to fill that void, had somehow found the one person who'd been there from the very beginning, the one person who'd made a promise to keep her safe. That night, after Ruby had finally gone to sleep after 3 requests for water and 4 for one more story, Dylan and Audrey sat together on the worn couch in his living room. The apartment was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the distant sound of Christmas music from a neighbor's apartment. Dylan told her everything, about the 2 years since his wife died, the crushing guilt of not being able to save her, of being grateful his daughter survived while his wife didn't, of not knowing how to hold both grief and gratitude at the same time, the loneliness of single parenthood, of making every decision alone, of having no one to share the small victories or catastrophic failures with. He'd tried dating, he admitted, a few times. Women he'd met through friends or on apps, women who seemed nice and understanding until they met Ruby and realized what they were signing up for. No one wanted to love someone else's child. No one wanted to compete with the memory of a dead woman. No one understood why he couldn't just move on. Audrey told him about her own loneliness, about pouring everything she had into her patients because she had no one to pour into at home, about feeling too much, caring too deeply, being told over and over that she was too invested in her work, too emotional, too unavailable for a real relationship, about giving up on finding someone who'd understand that her calling wasn't just a job, it was who she was. "I don't expect anything," Dylan said carefully, his voice low and honest. "I know this is fast and weird, and Ruby has a lot to take on." Audrey interrupted him, her voice firm. "Ruby is everything." Dylan blinked in surprise. "I've spent years caring for children and then saying goodbye," Audrey continued, tears threatening again. "Walking away when they are discharged, moving to the next patient, never knowing what happens to them. But Ruby," she paused, her voice breaking, "she's the one I never forgot. The one I thought about every Christmas, wondering if she was okay, if she remembered being held, if she knew how hard she'd fought. And now she's here and you're here and it feels like..." She searched for the words, "like maybe that promise I made to your wife wasn't just about a moment in a hospital. Maybe it was about this, about finding my way back to her, to both of you." Dylan reached out and took her hand, and they sat there in the quiet apartment while outside the city celebrated Christmas Eve, neither of them knowing exactly what came next, but both knowing they wanted to find out together. 6 months passed. 6 months of Audrey spending every weekend at Dylan's apartment, of Ruby running to greet her at the door, of family dinners and bedtime stories, and slowly, carefully building something real. Audrey and Dylan dated carefully, conscious of Ruby, conscious of moving too fast, conscious of the weight of what they were creating. Ruby called her Audrey, never pushing for more. But she looked at her like she was everything. Like she'd found the missing piece she'd been searching for in every stranger's face for 2 years. One evening in June, Audrey was helping Ruby clean up after dinner when she noticed the little girl drawing at the kitchen table with intense concentration. Ruby's tongue stuck out slightly, the way it always did when she was focused. Her crayons spread out in careful color order. Audrey walked over quietly, looking over Ruby's shoulder at the drawing. 3 figures holding hands. A tall one with dark hair labeled Daddy, a small one in the middle with pigtails labeled Me, and a third figure with light hair and a smile labeled Audrey. Above them, in Ruby's careful kindergarten handwriting, she'd written, Wama, my family. Dylan came into the kitchen, saw the drawing, and stopped. His eyes filled with tears as he looked at Audrey, as they both understood what Ruby had created. Not just a drawing, but a declaration. A truth this 5-year-old had known from the moment she'd seen Audrey crying in a restaurant. This was her family. All 3 of them. Together. That night, after Ruby was asleep, Dylan took Audrey's hand and led her to the couch where they'd had so many conversations over the past 6 months. I know it's only been 6 months, he started, his voice nervous and earnest. I know this is unconventional, that people would say we're moving too fast, that there are steps we're supposed to take. But Ruby's not the only one who's been looking for you, yo. He looked at Audrey with such raw honesty it took her breath away. I think I have been too. I think my wife somehow knew that the woman who saved our daughter, who made her that promise, would come back. Not just for Ruby, but for both of us. He wasn't proposing. Not yet. It was too soon and they both knew it. But he asked something that mattered more. Will you keep coming back? Will you be part of this family we're trying to build? Audrey was crying again, but this time they were good tears, healing tears. Yes, she said, her voice strong and certain. Always yes. Christmas morning arrived exactly 1 year after the worst blind date of Audrey's life. She woke up in Dylan's guest room, where she'd been staying more and more often. Her own apartment feeling empty and wrong. This place feeling like home. Ruby burst through the door before Audrey was fully awake, bouncing with the manic energy only a 6-year-old on Christmas morning could possess. It's Christmas! Come see! Come see! They went to the living room where Dylan was already in the kitchen making breakfast, the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls filling the apartment. Under the tree were presents wrapped in paper Ruby had clearly helped with. Tape everywhere, edges uneven, love in every crooked fold. They opened gifts together, Ruby squealing with delight over books and art supplies and, yes, finally the puppy Dylan had surprised her with, a rescue dog who was currently hiding under the couch, overwhelmed by the excitement. Then Ruby handed Audrey a wrapped gift, her face serious. I made it myself. Audrey unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a drawing, more detailed than Ruby's work from 6 months ago, showing 3 figures and a small dog. Ruby, Dylan, and Audrey, holding hands, hearts floating above their heads. The caption read in Ruby's now more confident handwriting, My Forever Family, and underneath in Dylan's handwriting that he'd clearly helped her add, 2 questions. Will you be my mom? Ruby, will you marry us? Dylan. Audrey's breath stopped. She looked up to find Dylan kneeling beside the couch, holding a small velvet box with a ring inside. Not elaborate, not flashy, just simple and perfect and real. Ruby was bouncing beside him, unable to contain her excitement. We practiced, she announced proudly. Daddy said I had to wait until you opened it, but it was so hard. Audrey was sobbing, nodding, unable to form words through the tears and joy, an overwhelming sense of rightness. Yes, she finally managed to say. Yes to both of you, always yes. She pulled them both into a hug, Ruby squished between them. All 3 of them crying and laughing and holding on tight. The family that had found each other through tragedy and promise, through a child's inexplicable memory and a nurse's faithful heart, through the worst night that had led to the best year. If this story reminded you that sometimes the worst moments lead us exactly where we need to be, subscribe to True Soul Narratives for more tales of hope, healing, and unexpected miracles. And as they held each other in that small living room with a Christmas tree and a confused puppy and more love than any of them had thought possible, a voice seemed to whisper through the moment, not audible but felt. A mother's blessing, a promise kept, a circle completed. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best ones. Sometimes a rejected blind date is exactly where you need to be. Sometimes a promise made to a dying mother is really a promise to yourself, to stay open, stay loving, stay ready for the family that's been looking for you all along. What would you do if a child asked you that question? Would you have stayed? Let us know in the comments and rate this story from 0 to 10. Merry Christmas, and may you find the family you're meant to have in whatever form it takes.